Hello, everyone. It's great to have you all. I see that right now we have 168 participants, so it's fantastic. So welcome to everyone. My name is Diego Sanchez Ancochea. I'm the head of the Oxford Department of International Development, and also a member of the Latin American Center. And it's fantastic to welcome you all. I have to also warn you that my internet is not particularly good, so if I freeze, I might actually take out my camera. So let me tell you a little bit of the origins of this webinar, and then present the speakers, and then we will go with the conversation. So this webinar, actually the origins, took place around 16, 17 months ago when I met Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who joined us and will speak in a second, in New York. And we really realized that it was very important for UNDP and more generally for the policy world to have more interactions in some of the key debates about developing worlds, but primarily about Latin America, with the academic world. And out of that conversation ran the idea of organizing a conference on inequality in Latin America, given that UNDP is working right now on a report, regional report on the issue, and given that Oxford social and economic dimensions as well. The one-day conference, in which I was actually very happy, I was going to introduce have Luis Felipe and Rebecca and Nora and Santiago, among others, in Oxford and in High Table and all the nice things that Oxford brings, obviously ended up not happening because of the pandemic, but we decided that it was important anyway to have an event to discuss some of the issues. And the fact that we have now almost 200 people here clearly shows the relevance. This is obviously an important topic always. It's an important topic, particularly now, given the pandemic, given the crisis, and given what might happen in the region after. So the goal today is not only to discuss the impact of the pandemic, although we will, but it's also to discuss and think about inequality more broadly. And I have to say that today is one of those days that it gives me huge pleasure to be able to be head of anything, because I have the opportunity to share with four of the people I value most in terms of debates on Latin America, four of the people that have influenced my thinking across my academic career. So they are by alphabetical order. First, Rebecca Greenspan. And I have to say, I'm going to say only a couple of words on each, because if I said everything about how they have influenced debates, from conditional cash transfers to how we think about inequality in the region, to the sustainable development goals, to governance, I would be here the hour and a half instead of letting them talk. So Rebecca Greenspan, General Secretary of the Ibero-American General Secretary, and previously Deputy Secretary General at the UN, at UNDP, and also Regional Director for Mexico and Central America at ECLAC. And previous to that, Vice President of a country I love and I work on, Costa Rica. Santiago Levy is Senior Fellow of the Brookings Institute. Previously, he was Vice President for Sectors and Knowledge at the IDB, and previously Minister of Finance in Mexico, and together with Nora and others, founder of Oportunidades. Nora Lustig, I'm leaving Luis Felipe to the end. Nora Lustig is Samuel Stone Professor of Latin American Economics at Tulane University, and as important or more, Director of the Commitment to Equity Institute, which many of you will know is shaping how we think about inequality and redistribution, initially in Latin America, increasingly now in other parts of the world, with the studies all over, including in the US. She is founder and past president of the Latin American Economics Association, that's the AFEA, former president of the Universidad de las Américas, and publisher of a lot of work on poverty and inequality in the region. And final, but not last but not least, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who is the co-organizer of this event, assistant administrator of UNDP and director for Latin America, previously at the World Bank, where he was the co-director and lead author of a report that influenced much of how we think about governance and the law from 2017. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for coming. I would like to start with a broad question, but I think it's significant, which is when you think about all your research across the years, and you think about inequality, what is that worries you most about Latin America inequality in terms of the past, but obviously in terms of the present? So maybe we can start with you, Luis Felipe. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Diego, and thank you for the invitation, for the openness to initially to have this conference in Oxford that we are, we all would like to be there. But given the situation, I think this is a very good opportunity to reflect on structural issues in Latin America that are being exacerbated by the current crisis. So in order to focus on your question, I want to tell you that, as you know, in UNDP and throughout the different projects I have engaged in my career, inequality has been at the center. And I want to mention three aspects that I hope will motivate the conversation. So one is more of a normative element. We care about inequality. There is this old statement by David Hume saying that fairness should be for social systems what truth is for systems of knowledge. So it is the essence of a social system. The pursuit of a social system should be the pursuit of fairness collectively. And I think that is a very serious normative element because it has to do with horizontal inequalities, with patterns of exclusion, and with the fact that collectively we should be able to create an environment in which everybody can pursue their, as we say in the capabilities approach, the life plans they have reasons to value and provide everybody with these elements. So there's a normative element. We care about inequality because of the importance of fairness in every social system. But there are two other elements that have more of an instrumental value. So when we talk, and partly related, and that's why I put it after the fairness aspect, is the fact that the lack of fairness and the systematic pattern of exclusion leads to an undermining of governance, in the sense, in two aspects at least. One in which people with relatively more capacity to influence the system start distorting decisions and distorting policy in their favor. So that creates a pattern of low trust in government, and it weakens institutions, and that creates eventually also social conflict. So inequality matters in that instrumental sense because it undermines governance and eventually leads to very unstable political settlements. And the third one, also of instrumental value, but very important, is that inequality typically is associated with missing opportunities for contribution to growth and to productivity. So basically, as we see systematic patterns of exclusion also lead, because of the fact that not everybody can develop their full potential, there is no access to credit, there is no accumulation of human capital, there are imperfections in certain markets, and people cannot access certain markets. So basically, not everybody can contribute productively in society, and that affects overall growth. So eventually, what happens is that inequality is associated also with a trap of low productivity, which is precisely one of the aspects that we want to analyze in the regional human development report that we're working on in Latin America. So I would say first, normative because of fairness. Second, these two instrumental elements, the impact on governance and the impact on productivity and growth.
Very much. Luis Felipe, how do you feel about these issues, are working about these issues in commitment to equity? What worries you most in those terms?
Diego, I assume you asked me, right? Because I
Yes,
couldn't
Nora.
hear you.
Right.
Yes.
Nora, go ahead.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, you were gone for a minute to me. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with all of you guys, even if it's just virtually. It's a pleasure, Diego, and hopefully we'll be able to do something like this physically, not into distant future. Well, I think that, I mean, you're going to come to this question later, that we had something happening in Latin America, which is very important, as we know, which is the decline that we observed in the 2000s, which was quite unique, quite striking, and that should not be overlooked because it gives us some hope that inequality can actually fall. And we'll go into the details of why it didn't sustain later, I think, in the discussion that you have prepared. What worries me is, well, why is this declining inequality? It was not sustainable. Why we saw that pretty much at the beginning of this decade, things started to kind of stall in that front. And I think we need to look at dynamics in the labor market and how education plays with the demand for labor in terms of how technical change is actually shifting the patterns of demand for labor that is actually impeding the trends that we had observed earlier to continue. I think it was also what worries me about inequality now is the fact that even though inequality declined, we know that concentration at the very top in Latin America continues to be very, very high. And that has, in addition to the fact that it has the aspect of unfairness, it also has an aspect that Luis Felipe already alluded to, which has to do with state capture. And I think that in many countries, the fact that you have the state capture is actually creating problems for growth, because you have oligopolistic power that has been perpetuated by the power concentrated at the top. You also have policies that are not inclusive as a result of this concentration of income in some countries and wealth, because they're not interested in actually in engaging in inclusive policies. So there are also this concentration at the top, beyond being something that could bother you because of the unfair aspect of it, since a lot of it was not created out of being, smart and having great ideas, but it comes from monopolistic power and rent capturing. It also creates rent capturing in the future and problems for moving forward. Finally, the thing that worries me very much now is that on top of the trends that we were observing, which is that the decline in inequality came to a halt in the mid of this decade, and the concentration at the top, is that I think the pandemic is going to create new inequalities. It is creating new inequalities as we speak, of course, because of the lockdown measures, etc. But I think the crisis that accompanies the pandemic, which would exist in Latin America, even if the pandemic had not reached Latin America, there would have been an economic crisis of very severe magnitude that will be there with us for quite some time. I think that it's going to create new inequalities currently and also for the future. My concern is that at present, because of the tremendous impact that the pandemic is having on people throughout the income distribution, but particularly the poor, the human capital of the poor is going to be severely eroded in many fronts. And that will create conditions for more inequality in the future, because the catching up is not going to be feasible. A lot of these effects are not reversible. And when we discuss policies, I think that we have to give priority to the policies that can prevent this human capital from deteriorating and making sure that we have less inequality growth in the future.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you so much. And I think you touch on a lot of the things we should touch today, which is how the region was coming from a good place, which actually interrupted before the pandemic. And as you say, the pandemic might make things even worse. So I think some of that we hope to discuss later. Santiago.
So good morning, and let me begin by thanking Diego at Oxford University and Luis
Santiago?
Felipe. Yeah, can you hear me? So I wanted to begin by thanking Diego at Oxford University and Luis Felipe at UNDP. And it's always a pleasure to be with Rebecca and Nora and Luis Felipe and you, Diego, in this panel. So the first remark, I want to center my remark on what I think is a key dimension of inequality, which has to do with inequality within the labor market. And this has been a long-standing structural deficiency in Latin America, which is that workers don't have access to opportunities in the labor market for advancement, and workers don't have the same opportunities for social insurance. This was there before the pandemic, and what this pandemic is going to do is going to worsen things terribly. We don't know yet exactly when this pandemic will end and exactly how long the fall in GDP and how long the fall in income levels is going to be. But I think we do know by now that what the pandemic will do is it's going to cause structural long-term damage to the labor market. And the reason will be is that many jobs, particularly jobs at the low end of the wage distribution, are probably going to disappear. That has to do with big sectors of the economy that are going to have to rethink themselves. Think of tourism, think of services, in which there are many low-income workers associated with those positions. And many of these activities will probably have to change in the way they're being carried out. We know from past crises that when there's a lot of job destruction, it takes quite a bit of time for those jobs to be recovered, particularly when there's job destruction in the formal sector. That is without pandemics. With pandemics, the process of job creation after this being deep job destruction can only take longer than what has taken in the back. And we do know from previous research that the scars that are left by workers that abandon the formal sector are deep scars in the sense that it takes them quite a bit of time to find another job, and that once they find another job, the lifetime wages that they're going to earn are going to be less than the wages that they were earning before they actually lost the job. So the job destruction that is happening right now, as Nora said, as we speak, that amount of job destruction is going to be the seeds of future inequality, which is going to add on to the amount of inequality that we've already experienced before, and is going to show up in the low part of the wage distribution, because much of the job destruction is going to occur there. And that's where it's going to take some time for this to happen. So the structural reasons are deep. And I want to close just by making one big point. We really have to rethink deeply labor markets. This is no longer an issue of let me tinker with this program and let me do a little bit of change on that program, or a little transfer here, or a little tax over there. What we really need is a complete rethink of the labor market, the regulatory structure, and the whole redesign of social insurance, because this is the only way in which workers at the low end of the wage distribution are going to have access to social insurance and are going to have access to a job with equal opportunities for advancement. And if the region doesn't tackle that, what I think the region is pretty much assuring is decades more of persistent inequality as we've had now. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Santiago. That's extremely useful. And I think your combination of what you said and Nora, I think reveals one of the problems with inequality, which again, I hope we can discuss, which is how it is divided by inequality at the top as being a big problem, and then the whole labor market problems that you were highlighting. So it's that double dimension that I think it makes it also particularly problematic. Finally, last but not least, Rebecca.
Yes, Diego, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with such friends and such good panel. Thank you, Luis Felipe and Diego, for inviting me. We have some noise in the back because there is some construction in the street. If you hear it and you don't hear me, tell me, please. So that's the problem of being at home. Well, you ask us what is it that worries us the most, yes? And I think that all of the interventions point to the fact that we are worried that the short-term impacts will evolve into long-term structural problems of the region, deepening inequalities, not for a short period of time, but for a long period of time, in a region that is already very unequal. And it's true what Nora says, that we managed to lower inequality before, but the truth is that this crisis finds Latin America in a weaker position than the one we had in 2008. With very low growth and much more social discontent. And so economically, the instruments and the fiscal space that these countries have to face the crisis is lower than before, is weaker than before. And also the patience and the willingness of citizens to bear with the costs of the pandemic and the crisis is lower. So I think that that has to be taken into account when we think about what is the political space and the economic and social space that the governments have to face the crisis. That will be my first point. My second point is that the things we didn't do is hunting us now, yes? We did not finish the tasks of the 20th century. We did not have universal healthcare systems. We do not have universal social protection or social security systems. We don't have the unemployment insurance in our countries, etc. There are several instruments and systems that are not universal and that by themselves deepen the impacts and the inequality impacts on the region. And so I think that what the former speaker said is very true. We are worried about the poor and the increasing poverty, but we are worried also for those, like Santiago said, that were not poor before, but were part of the informal sector. And the instruments that the governments have to get to those populations is very inefficient, to say the least. They have announced many measures, but I am not sure that it has gotten where it was needed. Many of those that they are waiting for the government's help are not receiving any help right now. And probably my last point has to do also with the productive structure that has to do precisely with the labor market problems that were mentioned before. So if we lose the small and medium-sized firms in our region, so there will be no recovery. The private sector hit, and the hit on those that provide most of the employment in the region is also a concern for all of us, because when we open the door to get out of the quarantine, we don't know which are or what is the productive structure and survival of the firms that we will find. And that has to do with the middle classes of Latin America. Latin America is a middle class society, and the impoverishment of the middle class, I think that deepens, Luis Felipe, also the governance problems that we are going to face in the future. Because we know what the middle classes that are disillusioned and desperate also can do in terms of going not for the recovery of the state, of the democratic state, but of, you know, forms of authoritarianism or populism that can be the phenomena that maybe will spread in some of the countries of the region.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So you all mentioned quite a few of the things I hope we can discuss later. So from the challenge to the labor market to the governance and political challenges that Rebecca just mentioned. But as Nora said, I think it's important to remember that the region comes from some success recently. And I wanted to get a sense from you of why you think we had that success, but more significantly also, what do you think we should learn from that decade of the 2000s in which things in terms of income distribution came later? And I don't expect in all of these questions now for everyone to respond, but to have a dialogue. Maybe Nora, given that you mentioned it and that you have done some work, we can start with you.
Okay. You know, I wanted to share something with you, if that's okay. In the
sharing is always good, Nora. So yes.
The screen. Can you see it? You see my screen?
Sorry, yes, we do.
All right. So,
Nora, if you can put it as presentation.
Yeah, let me do that.
Perfect, now we are perfect, thank you.
Okay, so this, I mean, Latin America did experience a decline in inequality in the 2000s, and we have, I have here, I mean, I think you've seen those before. This is all the regions in the world, their Gini coefficients in 2000 and circa 2018. And the diagonal would say that the Gini didn't change. Those above the diagonal means that Gini's increase. Those below, it means that they decrease. And as we can see, the blue squares, which are Latin America, practically all of them below the diagonal. And we find this pattern actually, even if you use different measures of inequality, like if you look at the top 10%, if you look at the 90-10 income ratio. So for the Gini skeptics, we can show that this decline in inequality was observed regardless of the measure you use. The only caveat I want to say is the one I said initially, is that we do not measure the top income, the concentration at the very top. But I think that what this data is telling us is that there was a decline, particularly in the labor market. The earnings inequality declined. And also there was some decline associated with the introduction of progressive cash transfers. Those were the two factors that explain primarily what happened to inequality in Latin America. In the labor market, our story, which is something that Luis Felipe and I worked and published in our book that came out at Brookings in 2010, I think it was, right, Luis Felipe? When, but we continue working on that afterwards. What happened in the region is that something that we usually say happens, but we were able to find evidence for it, is that investing in education in the previous decade resulted in a relative scarcity of people with lower skills and a relative abundance of people with higher skills. So the relative supply of labor changed in favor of people with lower skills. And given the demand patterns that existed during that period, the supply side dominated, and therefore we had a decline in the skill premium. And that drove primarily what happened to the labor markets in the 2000s. In addition, and that's why I wanted to show this graph, I think what happened in the 2000s is Latin America ended up being governed by a lot of progressive governments, leftist governments, left of center governments, some more radical, some more of the social democratic type. What we see in this graph is that inequality among those who were governed by the left declined more sharply. That's the red line. And the blue line were the non-left countries. And one of the things that we have been able to identify, although unfortunately not with the econometric results as we expected because of the difficulties of finding enough data, but what the least the descriptive statistics have been showing, is that probably one of the reasons why inequality fell more in the leftist countries is minimum wages. Those were the countries in which minimum wages were increased systematically during this period and helped the trend that was already happening. I mean, probably you would not have been able to do this if you didn't have the demand and supply patterns already taking place in the labor market. But given what was happening in the labor market per se, as market forces, the rise in the minimum wage reinforced the trend of higher increases in income at the bottom of the distribution. So that's the story of the 2000s, and it's a story that, in a way, and let me end with this, is a mirror image of what was happening in the US. In the US, earnings inequality increased, as we all know, and the studies that have been done by the leading labor economies in the US, I mean, Golding and Katz in particular, had one book in which they called it The Race Between Technology and Education, indicates that it was the opposite from what happened in Latin America, that supply of skilled labor became more scarce in the US, and the wage premium has been on the rise. And that was a driving force of rising earnings inequality in the US. So we had a good story in Latin America that was linked to something that's a policy lever that's very important, which is expanding access to education, which happened quite intensely in the 90s. And also the cash transfers, of which Santiago was one of the pioneers, which from the redistributive policy, the fiscal redistributive policy, reinforced this process. And finally, what you would associate to more progressive governments, which is increasing the minimum wages. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Nora. That's extremely useful to as a very good summary of what happened. Luis Felipe, maybe I can go to you and whether you have something to add, but also how you and UNDP is thinking about some of these issues as you write the report and as you think about governance and inequality in this term, and how meaningful you think this period was to think about some of those issues. And Nora, maybe you can
share. Yeah, I cannot go back. I don't know. Oh yeah, here I found it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luis Felipe.
Thank you very much, Diego. So I think the description that Nora just gave us is, shows a very clear picture. I would like, however, to bring precisely from that governance perspective, in a way, two elements to the conversation that are a little bit of a provocation to the standard conversation. So one is that I would argue that all that reduction in income inequality that we saw during those years was certainly was driven by changes in the labor market. As we, in the decompositions we showed, largest part was due to changes in labor market, and by the way, by a compression of the wage premium, as Nora just said, as opposed to what happened in the US. That further analysis, maybe Santiago can elaborate on that, shows that there may be issues related to this misallocation and eventually issues with productivity. But in any case, the fact that the labor market explained part of that, the other element, which was not trivial, is the better targeting of certain social programs, as Nora said. But my point would be here, and this is my main first message, is that this was a commitment to the reduction of poverty. That had an effect on inequality, but there was no political consensus about addressing inequality per se. So I think the political consensus during those years is that we had to address the issue of poverty and have better instruments to target the poor and many people who have never been actually receivers of public assistance. And I think that was done in a much more effective manner, but not necessarily a conviction and a political consensus that inequality is what we had to address. But certainly the effect of that is that there was a reduction in income inequality. So it was not, I would argue, until after the crisis of 2008, 2009, that actually the inequality issue per se started to be more present in the political discourse. So this is one first element that we have only very recently, I'm not talking about us because all of us have worked on inequality for a long time, but I'm talking about the political, let's say the political economy of inequality has been much more obvious present after the crisis of 2008, 2009, but not before. And this is an issue related to influence of certain groups, as I said at the beginning. As you know, when we talked about, and I haven't said this for a long time, but I kept repeating this when I was doing the WDR in 2017, that we were talking to among economists who, as I was always saying, when you talk about power, they can only think of electricity. And I think we have to understand the micro foundations of how power and influence affect these policies and these dynamics. And this leads to my second point, and it's that the very top incomes were untouched during all this process. So my point would be that at the margin, what we mainly measure is upper middle classes in the household surveys, is upper middle classes, vulnerable populations, poor populations, but not the top, as Nora very clearly said. So in a way, what we saw during those years was a redistribution, not necessarily taking money away from the middle classes and to address the poverty issue, but rather at the margin, allocating a budget to poverty that could be taken away from more investments in goods that are typically middle class. Some of them like universal education, universal health coverage. So all that was affected, I would argue, by the concern about poverty because the upper income class was untouched. So in that way, we had a redistribution, and I know I haven't been doing the proper research to show this, but we have I have this conversation with Nora for a while, that I think the redistribution was more from upper middle class and middle class to the poor without touching the upper classes. And that has, in a way, been reflected in this engagement of the middle class or the lack of trust of the middle classes with the political class. So we see middle classes in Brazil, Mexico, Chile saying, well, we have been abandoned by the system. And we have some figures, in Brazil and Mexico, more than 70%, or in some cases close to 80% of the population in surveys in Latinobarometer say the political system is at the service of the top class. And this is reflected in political outcomes that we see. And as Rebecca was saying, this may lead, because all these structural elements have interacted with a shock that has been really deep and has exacerbated all these inequalities. And that is, we are really in a moment in which we, certainly as UNDP, we're trying to work very hard every day with the governments to try to reconnect the citizens with this capacity to trust institutions, because there is a real risk for a disconnection and then a move towards more populism and the weakening of democratic controls that took a long time in the region to build. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. And I think you highlight a point that actually Nora has highlighted a lot on how important it is to have information on top incomes in Latin America, right? And how much we need also more information from taxes. Santiago, I wonder whether I can go with you on this issue of how much labor markets, I mean, you said the problem of labor markets and the combination with social policy. How much do you think the 2000s were changing the right direction? And how much do you think now, moving slowly to discussing the pandemic as well, the pandemic will or not break with all the gains from the 2000s?
So let me make 3 points. The story on the wage differential, which played a large part in the fall of inequality in the first decade of this century, it's a very complex story, and it really varies from country to country. In some countries, it had to do a lot with increases in the real minimum wage. Think of Brazil. But in some other countries, there were no large increases in the minimum wage, and you still had the same phenomenon of falling wage differentials. In some work that Luis Felipe and I have done for Mexico, we actually think that the fall in the wage differential in Mexico is actually not good news. Even though it drops inequality, the main cause behind the fall in the wage premium in Mexico is actually the fact that on the demand side of the labor market, the composition of firms was continuously shifting in the direction of smaller and smaller informal firms that don't demand people with more education and more skills. So yes, the educational system was doing its job and the supply of people with more education was increasing. But on the demand side of the labor market, what happened in Mexico is that there were ever more smaller firms, ever more firms that were informal, and these firms don't require more human capital, and that's why the wage premium fell. So if you want, this is the wrong reason why you want inequality to go down. This is different from another same exposed phenomenon of falling wage premium, which might be caused because minimum wages went up. So we have to be careful about separating the microeconomic determinants of what is happening in each case. And in some cases, I think Mexico is a very good example, this might not be good news. And it might actually be part of the reason why the region is not growing so fast, because it's continuously misallocating resources, something that we don't pay enough attention to. And it's the reason why productivity in the region stagnated. So that's my first point. Careful about the interpretation of the wage differential and the wage premium. The second point is, I think that something that Luis mentioned, which I want to bring back up again, very little was done with top incomes on the tax side, but also on a very important source of income concentration in America, which has to do with monopoly power and antitrust. The real, very high top concentration has to do with the exercise of monopoly rents and the so far not too efficient ability of government state apparatus through antitrust agencies and competition commissions and whatnot to really do something similar to what was done in the United States in the early 20th century with the Sherman Act and the work that was done by Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt, when they broke up the big trusts. And that really was a change both in the structure of incomes at the very top and in the structure of power. That hasn't happened. And neither has it happened really that taxation at the very, very top with the data that we can see has there. So the fall in inequality, yes, has a good sides through some of these transfer programs, and that's good. Has some part having to do with wage differentials. In some cases, a good story. In some cases, is a bad story, not clear. In the case of Mexico, it's not such a good story. It's actually a sort of a depressive story. And the political consensus to fight inequality, as Liz was saying, has not shown up in top incomes. So it's been easier to try to reduce inequality by redistribution rather than by taxation at the top, antitrust, and elimination of monopoly rents. The last point that I want to make is that, in fact, some of this redistribution that has been showing up in a lot of these transfer programs is really not that much redistribution because some of it is intertemporal redistribution. Let's not forget that what has happened in the region is that debt to GDP ratios have been going up. So some of these transfers have been paid with borrowing. It is not that we're taxing other people, partly yes, but partly we're just borrowing. So we're redistribution from the future to the present. We're laying off these huge debts, right? And countries have these big debts, and on the basis of that, we're doing a lot of this. And that's because, that was my second point, taxation at the top hasn't really taken place, and because we still continue to use very inefficient mechanisms to redistribute through all sorts of, many programs that are very inefficient, and a lot of loopholes in taxation, in consumption taxes, and things like that don't really do the work. So my bottom line is that there really is a lot of homework to be done. at the very, very top on antitrust and on taxation. And in the middle, a complete redesign of social insurance, moving towards universal programs, and a complete redesign of the mechanisms that regulate the labor markets, so that all your investments in human capital can actually yield positive results and not produce all these people that are getting university degrees and high school degrees and are entering the labor markets to get these grand informal jobs. But don't worry, we'll give you a little transfer on the side to compensate.
Diego, may I ask a follow-up question to Santiago, if you want to do this as a...
Yes.
Because I think, Santiago had a very key position at some point of his illustrious career, which was in the Comisión de Competencia in Mexico. And you hit on the head of the nail very well when you said that one of the problems that we're facing in Latin America is the inability to actually undo the regulation that has given monopoly and oligopolistic power to lots of the people who are now the richest in the world. Now, one of the problems that I think has happened is that the reason, precisely because you have these people being the richest in the world, they're have been able to block the changes in the, even, you were there. What can you tell us about how, what needs to change in order for this to happen? Because you're sort of like stuck in an equilibrium in which you made these people rich, and at the same time, then they are the ones who put in the barriers to actually undo these legislation and regulation that would make them less rich. So how do you get out of that?
So let me go to Santiago and then to Rebecca.
So that's a very good question, Nora, and it's extremely difficult. It goes back a little bit to the point that Luis was making about the nature of the state. From my own experience in the Competition Commission, we brought the cases. In some cases, it was a case of collusion in the treasury bill market in Mexico by banks. And you bring the cases, they go to the judicial power through the amparo, and then they're lost forever. There was a famous case that the Competition Commission brought against Telmex. And through various maneuvers in the judicial power outside of the Competition Commission, the case took 10 years. And 10 years later, the judge ruled that because this was evidence from 10 years ago, it was no longer applicable and the whole case was dismissed. So it's beyond just the design of the competition law and getting a technical agency to be able to implement the competition law. The judicial power also has to be somehow reformed because there's a huge amount of rent seeking and there's a huge amount of influence peddling at the level of the judicial power beyond the executive powers. And this transformation of the state is very difficult to carry out, but the absence of this transformation is a reason why you have this persistence of monopoly rents and persistence of power of people that are able to keep on rigging the system in their favor, capturing huge amount of incomes at the very, very top. And if we had the right numbers, and you know better than I do that these numbers are not there, probably we would be measuring even higher inequality than what's actually there, because a lot of this wealth and a lot of these incomes are actually not being even revealed. And this is something that we need, and we need to think about the politics, the political economy, and this is a discussion that goes beyond transfers and that goes into a different direction, and that's where we need to do some of the work. Of course, we have to work on the labor market stuff, but this is part of the story of inequality in the region.
Rebecca, given that all your experience also in politics, the floor is yours.
Well, I was going to say, taking the point from Santiago and Nora, the former point, let me say that this is the same problem we have for fiscal reforms. Yes, the same phenomena that we experience with respect to antitrust and monopoly power, we experience also when we want to have more progressive fiscal reforms in the region. And it's something that is not easy to break. But I think that we are getting to the point, really, Diego, that there is more awareness, I think, in some of the factual powers of the risk that we are facing in just business as usual with respect to what was happening. And maybe we have a possibility, an opportunity here with this crisis to go for something that has been discussed and said a lot these days, that is a new social compact. And when Santiago says that the whole redesign of the systems of the health and social security and protection systems has to be done, I completely agree that we have to adjourn these systems to the new realities. And the new realities are that we are going through technologies where we will have more self-employed and where we will have more people that if the systems do not change, will not be covered again, not by health and not by social security and not by pensions. So maybe we have an opportunity here to go for a new social compact in society. And we have to push for it. And now, precisely now, because in the emergency, everybody is thinking about getting out of the water, staying alive, you know. But what we do now will determine our possibilities of really taking a different path later on. In a way, Diego, I've been thinking that we are really experiencing now the starting of the 21st century. Centuries do not start, you know, chronologically. This is really, I think, the start of the 21st century. And I think that many of the tendencies that we were seeing before are coming with a speed that is really scary in terms of the digitalization of society and entering to a digital society in full, and also in the labor market, because I expect that the technology transformations we were seeing will take a deeper step right now. I think that firms will become more efficient and more with technologies that save more labor and in demand of more qualified labor. And so people, there is a generational problem here, yes? Two sides. One is that people of my generation or younger will be out of the labor market when this crisis is over. So we will have a generation with huge difficulties to enter the labor market again. And in the young, we will have a sluggish labor market that is not able to include them in a full manner. So I think that we should end what we started in the 20th century for universal health and social protection systems. We need to do something in education, because it's true, Nora, that the expansion of education and health was very significant, but the quality of the services was really behind what was needed. And so if we have dropouts like we had in the 80s, dropouts from the educational system for the kids, for primary, secondary, and university students, we will have really long-lasting effects of groups of people that won't have the qualities to get to decent work in the labor market. I'm very worried about the educational inequalities that are rising again with this pandemic. And I think that the private sector should be part of this discussion in a meaningful way, that there is more awareness in certain sectors of the private sector, that they have to change their business model to be able to have a more stable society. Instability is bad for everybody. So let me just say again that I think that we have to make a call for building new consensus for what is coming, for a new social contract, for a new fiscal reform, and for the, for a democratic way of decision making. Yes, because decisions will be made. What I'm not sure is that they will be made in a democratic process that can lead us to a different world when we finish with this shutdown.
Thank you, Rebecca. So there's questions accumulating, but before I move to that, you touch on the last issue that I wanted to discuss, which is very much, and several of you mentioned already, which is how do we respond to all of this, right? So we have a past, we have a whole set of problems, we have the pandemic that you said, several of you at the beginning, will make things worse, and it's what should be the key policies, but also whether you are optimistic about pessimistic, right? Because it's easy sometimes to do policy recommendations. It's harder to be optimistic about some of those, although Rebecca was quite optimistic about the potential for a new social contract. So maybe Luis Felipe, I can start with you, do a round to everyone about both policies, but also credibility or likelihood of those policies, and then we can open the floor for those questions that are being accumulated.
Thank you, Diego. So I do share this view that Rebecca has, that this shock could be an opportunity, but I think we have to be clear about what exactly are the elements that could be sort of the turning points in terms of the new, because we talk about many things and say, what is the new normal? Well, we have to try to influence what that new normal will look like. And there are a few aspects. So, but one principle that I think we could use is the idea of sustainability, broadly speaking, sustainability as a principle towards recovery. And that, by that I mean economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental. So we think of sustainability in the sense of having more harmonic, long-term, cohesive societies that leads to certain policies or certain areas in which we would like to influence. So one is, for example, the interaction with nature. I think these, the increase in this type of shocks related to the interaction of humans with nature. I mean, it's a very clear pattern related to many things, not only this pandemic, but also the environment. So the idea of how we try to bring more climate action and natural capital as an engine for recovery. I'm not saying we have to make, the super immediate transformation, but at the margin, trying to have more investments, for example, in clean energy, in all elements related to climate action and biodiversity, and how human capital can be turned. In some cases, they call it in the Caribbean and other places the blue economy, right? So now the economy has colors, but the blue economy is basically economic diversification, in the sense of making the main asset of those countries, which is the ocean, an engine of growth and an engine of prosperity. So how we can find specific elements in that area. So how, in terms of environmental interaction between humans and nature, and that is something that, by the way, the Human Development Report for 2020, the global Human Development Report, will be dealing with. The second element, I would say, is the social protection and fiscal systems as the backbone of the social contract. What we agree as collective, society, as actors in the society, is how much it goes to the public, in the sense not of government, but in the sense of what has public value, and what is the contribution that everybody has to make into that. And that creates the foundation for social sustainability. So that has to do with what Santiago said about thinking about institutional reforms and thinking about how we finance a more universal system that both assists and protects people from shocks. And I think that is something that Why would this be feasible now? I think because people have realized how much of a threat it is for everybody not to have this type of system. So this is the second element, I would say, social protection and fiscal systems, to rethink that as the backbone of what maintains the social contract. And one third element that is a little bit of instrumental, but at the same time, it's transforming the way we interact, is digital, the technology and digitalization, because there's a lot of conversations about this, but this is transforming the way we interact. It's transforming and affecting politics. And it's, you know, I have written recently about this notion that people think that digital identity is political voice. If you have an opinion in Facebook or in Twitter, you think that you are politically engaged, and you are not politically engaged, because at the same time, people don't go to vote. And, you know, more than 80 million people in Latin America who had the right to vote didn't vote in the last 5 years, but everybody had an opinion in Twitter or Facebook. So this idea, how digitalization is changing the way we interact. So we have to take digital systems as a core element also in the way we interact, the way we reach out to people, the way we bring education and health to everybody, information, transparency. So these digital elements, we have to take them seriously, because they are sort of an ungoverned space. So they are changing the way we govern ourselves, but we are not regulating, we are not taking that seriously. So sorry, but I would, there are many others, but I would say there are three aspects I think we can work collectively, and we can try to move the new normal into something more sustainable and inclusive. I would argue these three elements are fundamental. Thank you, Diego.
Thank you very much. Nora.
Okay, Diego, I want to share screen again, if it's okay, and bring us to the current situation. Mm-hmm. Let me move to something else. And let me put it in the presentation mode. So I'm going to be showing something that we're doing here with my colleagues in the CQ Institute with two of our PhD students, Valentina Martinez, Federico Sanz, and Steve Younger, who's our he's a consultant for the CQ Institute. We're looking at the potential impact of current lockdowns on a bunch of Latin American countries, and to identify what kind of policies you would need to implement in order to cushion the blow now from the lockdowns. But the simulations will also then move on to include what might happen beyond lockdowns, because, like I said at the beginning, the crisis that is happening in the region goes beyond the sort of self-inflicted crisis due to the containment policies. It has to do with the adverse shocks that we're getting from the huge declines in activity in the developed world, and the reduction in growth, the slowdown in growth in China. So we've been looking at the patterns of income composition for countries. Right now, I'm showing you Argentina and Colombia, and I'm showing urban, because for Argentina, we only have now urban data. As you know, the survey in Argentina doesn't include rural areas. And just to tell you what you're seeing, there's the blue, the dark blue is the income at risk, the portion of income at risk at every step of the distribution of income. This is the poorest person. Here we have gross income from the poorest to the richest. And the blue, in both cases, describes the income at risk, which is defined using it's defined using what is the non-essential, what cannot be done remotely, and the details will be in the paper, but it's defined as it's usually defined. Then, we have the incomes that are less at risk. Some of them are not at risk at all at this point, like cash transfers. These are the cash transfers. The orange ones are the cash transfers that are part of the safety net system, the non-contributory ones. The light gray is contributory pensions, which in Argentina represent quite a bit of people, families' incomes. The light blue is public employment, which is also much less risky than many other employment forms. And the green are the considered to be essential and those that can be implemented remotely. What I want to show here is two things. One is that you can see that incomes at risk are throughout the income distribution. It's not just at the bottom. So if you begin to sort of think about people losing income, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a lot of people losing income that are not the poor. And so some of them, which might be closer to the poor around here, will become poor as a result. And some of them may stay poor after that if you don't have enough ways to actually cushion the blow. In addition, the poor, the already poor, even though they have the safety net given by the cash transfers, which are very progressive, as we can see here. And by the way, also the yellow is interesting because this is consumption of own production, which if you go to rural areas, it's also sort of like a safety net because people have the ability to continue producing in their plot of land. Even though you have this, the coverage is still around 30% of households have this among the bottom 20% in Argentina, around close to 40% in Colombia, and the average transfer in Colombia is lower. You still will have impoverishment of the poor. So you will need to implement policies that both address, and that's what many countries are trying to do, address those who are at the bottom because they're the poorest already, the chronic poor, so that you can contain their falling further into poverty. But also a lot has to happen, particularly among those who are vulnerable to becoming poor as a result of either containment policies or the economic crisis. It seems that we have ways to reach some of them in both cases, because if they're formal workers and they're here, then you have them registered. If they're recipients of cash transfers, then you also have them registered. So if you have the fiscal funds, which is the if, then you can reach them with transfers and cushion the blow during the current crisis. If not, then we are stuck in a problem that is, we first need to find them. And yesterday we were in a seminar that the IDB organized, and apparently Mubarak in Yale, working with some of his team members, have identified ways using cell phone technology and machine learning to identify people who are not in registries now, and that you could probably reach with cash transfers, and that this could probably be done fairly quickly. And so I think we may have to explore these solutions, which are the digital solutions, to try to sort of come closer to those who may need the transfers now, and at least for the period in which the impact of the crisis and the containment policies are very, very sharp. In addition, when we're talking about the poorest of the poor, the chronically poor, as we know, their deprivations are multiple. They are multidimensional issues there, and that will not be taken care of just by cash. One of the things that concerns at least me a lot is the sort of educational gap that is going to be widened now, because if before there was a difference in quality of education across the income distribution in terms of the basic education, now that has worsened tremendously, because during lockdowns, there's a big new divide, which is people who still have access to education because they have internet connection and they have computers or tablets, and then they can continue their education online. And also they tend to have the right coaches at home, because parents, usually from educated parents, they can be tutored and helped and mentored during the process. At the bottom, you have pretty much the opposite. Lots of people without access to internet, and so they're not possible, they're not enabled to continue education even if they want it. And even if you include the access to education through technology, who is going to be there to help them navigate this access through online learning, which is very different than face-to-face? As deficient as it is better than just having someone speaking to you through a screen with nobody coaching you on the other side. So I see what can this cause is that reversals in the progress of education that may take a long time to undo. Because what this may lead is to higher dropout rates, not only what people are missing now, it's going to be just the 3 months that are affecting people's access to education. There's probably going to be an increase in dropout rates, an increase in the postponement of access to education when people should start going to primary school, and also a reduction of moving from one education level to the other after graduation, which is what we've seen in past crises. And therefore, the educational divide will increase again. Education inequality will probably increase, and that may cause, more, like I said at the beginning, an increase in inequality in the long term. So let me stop here.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and that sounds like a fascinating paper. I hope it's out soon. So let me move to Santiago. And Santiago, there's quite a few questions on your comment about the labor market and the labor market reform in the questions and answers. So clearly that left a lot of people wanting to know more. So maybe as you discuss some of the policies, you can also discuss this issue of the labor market.
So, okay, thank you. I want to take your question. And I think your question before, Diego, is, will this shock be big enough to produce the sort of changes to move us into what Rebecca was calling a new social contract or a new social compact? So the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. We do know now that the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which 10 years ago, we were all saying, wow, the world is coming to an end. 10 years later, it is clear that that shock was not big enough. Because Latin America didn't really change much as a result of the 2008-2009 crisis. So that shock was not big enough. Will this shock be big enough? I don't know. But if it is something like the Great Depression of the 1930s, then the question is, if the shock is big enough, will the outcome be the right outcome? And you can think of the 1930s and the outcome being the New Deal in the United States, or you can think also of the Great Depression and the outcome being Hitler and Nazism in Germany. Big shocks produce big changes, but it is not evident that those big changes are going to be in the right direction. So even if this shock is truly big, we have to do a lot more to ensure that the shock ends up politically in the direction of the social compact or the change in the social contract that we do. I don't think that even within academia and even within policymakers, there is clarity as what do we mean by social compact and social contract. Everybody likes to talk about it. But once you really get down to a little bit, what does it really mean? My interpretation at this point is that if you put 10 people and say, tell me your model of labor market reform, tax reform, and social insurance reform, that would be the core element of the new social compact, you would get 10 different answers. It is not like there's clearly a policy out there that is just waiting for a big shock to come in and have the political opening to come in. I think, in my view, we're at the stage yet in which there's a lot of discussion and we need much more debate. Coming to your question about the people who want to say a little bit more about the labor market, any change in the regulations in the labor market that leaves alive the categories of formal and informal employment must be considered a failure. unless you are doing a labor reform that eliminates the border between formality and informality and changes the dynamics of job creation and job destruction, your reform has failed. If you're only doing a little pension program for this group, another little health program for that group, a little microcredit for these people over there, a little transfer for these other people here, and tinkering at the edges, in my view, you failed. We have to learn from the history of the last 20 years that an agglomeration of programs is not a coherent policy. And that the incentives implicit in those programs really matter. And I don't think we're there yet, even within the academic community and even with the policymaking community. And even if we're there yet, then the real big issue would be, how do you communicate that to society at large and convince society at large that you have to do a huge fiscal reform and a huge reform of regulations to be able to create a more prosperous society and a different social compact. So I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, but I'm saying there's a lot of homework to be done if we want to take advantage of this crisis before we can actually make the transition to where we want to go. Stop here.
Rebecca, how do you take, how do we get this opportunity and make it into a meaningful opportunity?
Well, I think that I would agree with all what has been said in a way. I share with Nora the concern about education and deepening inequalities in such a structural manner as we are seeing. And the issues that Luis Felipe and Santiago raise are very true. I don't know if the shock is big enough. And even if it is, I don't know if we are going to derive the right lessons from it. And probably when we talk about building consensus and a new social compact, we are not talking about unanimity. There will be a fight. There will be tensions. There will be different positions. The question is how to make a process that allows us to go to a different place than just let things happen as they anyway will, yes? And there, let me say that I have some hope in the youth and the women of the region. I think that those are groups that are pushing for changes. Because before we will be talking only about parties, yes? Which are the parties, what are the arrangements that we can do between parties. I think that that will be part of it, but I don't think that in the societies we have now, there will be all of it. There will be some citizen pressures on the changes that they are asking for. And I think that what we saw in Latin America before the pandemic, yes, before the lockdown, was similar to what I'm saying. It was not the parties or a party that led the discontent in the streets. It was a much more chaotic, in a way, yes? Chaotic way of expressing the discontent. My worry is that if it doesn't get to a political process, to an institutionalized process, so we will have less than a perfect result, yes? Because chaos doesn't make coherent policies and at least a new project of society. So my point is, if there is no process to take it on, we will have a very chaotic flow for the future that I am worried about, because this connects with the problems of populism and authoritarianism that our region knows so well. So I will go with the last phrase of Santiago. We need to be activists in trying to see what process to put in place for more investment in the things that matter to people, that is health and education and jobs and security. I will end up with this phrase that some of you have heard me say, between the optimist and the pessimist. You are right, Diego, I'm kind of optimist, but I like the phrase from Simon Perez that said that, you know, optimist and pessimist die the same, in the same way, but the difference is how we live. You know, pessimism is really the mobilizer of society. So if we are not optimistic, if we don't have any hope, or if we cannot inspire, so we cannot go, you know, for better policies and a better society. So this will be my end point.
So there's a whole set of questions, and I'm seeing it and try to make sense of them and find a way to ask them meaningfully, but I think it's hard. And I'm also conscious of time and the fact that in this online world, going over more than 1 hour and 30 minutes complicated. So as we move towards finishing, I want to make one of these questions, which is sometimes silly, but I think it highlights the complication of where we are, which is, if you had to start with one thing as we move forward in terms of policy, the one priority, and several of you already touched on them, but the one priority that should be and that is somewhat politically possible, of course, because we cannot ask for the moon, what would that be for each of you? So again, let me do the final round and that as conclusion. So Luis Felipe, and you got, let's be fair, you can choose one. You cannot just answer by choosing many, saying that you are choosing one.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. That's a complicated question, but you know, in a way, in a previous intervention, I mentioned areas in which I think we can focus. Now, I would like to talk more, maybe given this opportunity that you give me, to talk about how we get to the consent. I really liked the previous interventions in terms of the discussion about where we want to go and how we can influence the direction, because it is clear that this idea that this is going to reshape the world and let's wait to see what comes out is not a good idea. We are in positions of responsibility, that we have the responsibility, the task to be part of that change in a certain direction. But one element that I think is key, I think what I'm going to say is a bit of a caricature, so I don't want to be unfair, but we came also from early 2000s, where basically we said, let's bring the best people to tell us what is the best policy. And then we know where to go, because these are the best policies. Why? Because these people know and they are telling us what is the policy. So this idea of the right policies, I think we're hiding two aspects. One is that there is no policy prescription without a normative framework. So this notion that you go from evidence to policy, because then if you have the right evidence, the policy is obviously the right one. It's not true. You have a normative framework in between. And the issue is that sometimes the same evidence can lead different people to think that the right policy is different, because the normative framework or where we want to go is different. And we have to acknowledge that. And I think that is one element that leads us to think that this idea of having always the best policy and import it and implement it is not the right way to go, because we have to understand what is the normative framework in between, and the fact that in the society where you want to implement this, there may be people who think different. And that leads to the second element, which is the importance of going beyond the best policy to then go to to emphasize more the policy process, which means what is the policy, the process among actors that leads to the agreement of what is the policy. It's exactly what Santiago was saying, what Rebecca was saying, in the sense, what it means to redefine that, Bob Hackett in Cornell calls it the politically constituted we. So how we go about defining collectively where is where we want to go. But that can also lead to very chaotic situation. So that requires leadership. And I think we have to acknowledge that we're facing a serious crisis of leadership, because so if you ask me to, you said one. So one thing is emphasize more the policy process, to bring the actors to open discussion, and then define collectively what is the way we want to go. And then once we define there, we have institutions and rules that lead us in that direction. But that requires leadership, and that's my concern. I think we have to find and try to strengthen at the local level, at the regional level, at the global level, to try to strengthen the leadership of those who can influence. But I do see a deficit there. But if you ask me one thing, I would say, and we from UNDP try to bring this, is more evidence, more discussion about normative elements, but bring everybody to the table and to discuss and to reach agreements. And I think that will be key. That process of legitimacy, in my view, will determine a lot of the sustainability of any solution that comes out of this crisis. Thank you, Diego.
Yes, no, I think that's a great point. That is not about policy or just about policy. I was asking about the process, and the political process is so important. Nora, you already started with many of the issues with your graphs, but
right. Although I'm very concerned with the impoverishment of the middle class, I am a prioritarian in philosophical terms. So for me, the poor come first. And I think that I would focus primarily on helping the poor weather the current storm. If you need to add cash transfers, if you want to the people who are not receiving them, and increase them for those whose other sources of income have declined. But more importantly, really focus on avoiding the costs that may be irreversible to the poor. And those involve malnutrition in utero or in the early stage of their lives, the missing the access to education. It also involves episodes of abuse and violence that leave long-lasting scars within the family. So I think you need to have a social protection agenda for the poor now that has to be very focused. And this is work that Mariano Tomasi and I have been doing. Wrote a paper for Luis Felipe that came out yesterday, by the way. I don't know if it was announced, but this is a moment to probably announce it, in which we say it's very important to focus on the poor. And for that, you need to have a very careful, if you want, articulation that involves many parts of government, that cannot work in parallel. There has to be a unifying structure that looks at what needs to be implemented specifically to address people who are poor and vulnerable in slums or in rural communities, in indigenous communities, in the communities that are defined by sexual preferences. I mean, you have a lot of people who are poor and vulnerable that are sometimes completely forgotten from the strategies, and that, well, now in the pandemic, forgetting them has, in addition, the problem that then they become a boomerang, because they are the people who can then infect the rest if you don't address them. But more importantly, if you want to protect the human capital of the poor, you need to have a coordinated strategy. And I think, let me emphasize again the issue of education. So what I would do is see what do we need to do, make sure that the young, the small children and the young do not miss out of education during this process, which will require infrastructure from the electronic, being able to have access to data, and the hardware that's needed to continue education remotely if during the lockdowns. And second, mechanisms that can actually help the mentoring process so that they're not left on their own, even if they have access to being able to continue to educate themselves. And once the lockdown are gone, then I think we need to accompany these groups to make sure that all these factors that could help them become less poor in the future, because the crisis will continue, like I keep emphasizing, are in place. And I want to give you just one example of what happens if you don't have coordination. Can I? And I don't know, in Mexico, for example, right now, we have a progressive government, but austerity has reduced the budget of the indigenous, the Instituto Indigenista. And that is actually putting in jeopardy La Casa de la Mujer Indígena, which is where indigenous women go when they're subject to violence, some domestic violence, or they need health care. So you are destroying something that for a government that says los pobres primero doesn't sound consistent. And this is the kind of mistake you can make, which is huge, because anything that happens there is going to be an irreversible shock. It's huge if you do not have a coordinating agency that looks at what's happening throughout and makes sure that the protection is not just of transferring cash, is that it also ensures that institutions that address the needs of the extremely poor in different parts of the country are taken care of.
Thank you so much, Nora. And that's extremely useful and with a lot of things to think about. Santiago.
So thank you, Diego. I'll take your question. In the context of COVID and thinking a few months from today, assuming that eventually the pandemic could be controlled, I like Luis's point about process. So we have to bet on democracy. We cannot expect redeemers. In Latin America, we have a long tradition of caudillos, and we have a long tradition of redeemers from this side or the other side or whatever side that possess the truth and interpret the popular will, and they know what needs to be done. So I think that needs to be rejected. I think we have to bet on the process, and the process has to be democracy, and democracy is messy and complex, but is better than all the alternatives. So betting on the process, what is it, the one structural change that in a post-COVID world, I think would be, I put at the top of the agenda? As a first step of the social compact, universal health insurance. I can't think of anything that would be more pro-poor, more fair, and if it is well done, more pro-growth than universal health insurance at this stage. And this, I mean seriously, not a collection of programs with different levels of quality, different sources of funding, and different types of provision. Make people equal in one dimension critical to their lives: access to health. British style, NHS style. It can be done. It's not a matter of not having
Costa Rican style.
Or Costa Rican style. So there are many models out there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's a matter of agreeing on at least one first step. We can then talk about labor market, we can then talk about pensions, we can then talk about, let's agree through a democratic process on one goal post-COVID. Serious universal health insurance that delivers in practice, not rhetoric, the same quality of healthcare to everybody, beginning with the poor, and does it, this is very important, does it without messing up the labor markets in the way that has been done in most countries in Latin America so far. So that's where I would begin.
Thank you so much, Santiago. That's extremely useful. Rebecca.
Yes, Diego. I think that while the lockdown is on and we're still in it, I will differ from Nora. I will go for a universal social protection policy. I really believe that if we don't take care of all of those that are losing heavily from the pandemic, that are not only the poor, there will be no way of any political process that can get us to a more cohesive project. There is no way in which, again, I think we can protect the poor, make the middle classes pay, and do nothing for the vulnerable and middle classes. A political democratic process cannot go farther with a situation like that. So I will argue for a universal social protection policy during the pandemic. And I will go with Santiago about a universal health system for the reconstruction together with education. I think that health and education continue to be the spine of any democratic and system that is really supported by citizenship.
Diego, may I just say, I totally agree with that. Okay. I think both, I mean, you asked us for one. So I emphasize the one that I think has to be the focus, but I don't see it as an alternative of a universal system of social protection. But universal system of social protection doesn't always mean giving cash to everybody. It means maybe using targeted interventions to actually have universal outcomes. That's one thing. In the case of the pandemic, I do agree, but we do need to think of the following. We do want to compensate the losers, and we want to compensate the losers who are poor and protect the poor multidimensionally. We face resources that are scarce. So we may have to face the same dilemma sometimes, the same horrible dilemma that doctors that are dealing with people coming into the hospital and having to decide based on triage criterion. Who do you take care of first? And that's what we need to, unfortunately, we need to think about that. We may not have resources to take care of everybody. So what do we do when that happens? Now, not what our ideal is. What do we do if resources are scarce? And we're forced the same way as doctors are in hospitals when they're overwhelmed with patients, and we need to implement a triage system. Let me stop here. I think that it's such a horrible question that I don't like to have to answer it, but I think that that's, what we're facing in many cases.
But Nora, yes, I completely understand. And sorry, Diego?
No, go, but yeah, but I need to
I completely understand. I was in that position, in the 80s when I was in the Ministry of Finance. And it's a very hard question, but let me tell you that the amount of resources that are needed for a temporary income for all of those that are locked down and don't have enough, maybe they are not poor, but they don't have enough to go through this, is not so large. We are not talking about 10% of GDP.
Yeah, we're calculating those, and hopefully we can do everything. But I'm just saying that we may have
not
to
everything.
face three.
We will have to reassign resources too.
I need to stop
but
here.
But to left out part of the a population that will be hardly hit will be a mistake.
Agree. That I agree with. And I didn't mean to say that. I mean, I thought you wanted to have a conversation, dear.
No, I know, but I need to stop the conversation. No, I would love to continue for hours, but you don't know, you cannot imagine how much, but I know some people have to go. I do have to go. So no, that conversation is exactly the one I wanted, but we have gone for 1 hour and 40 minutes. So I think we need to stop, but clearly it's a demonstration that we need to continue the conversation. So let me stop here just with a couple of comments and a thank you. So first, I'm very aware that we discussed the region as a whole, and several times, several of you and Santiago mentioned, there's obviously a lot of country diversity, and it's something we need to think about much more than we were doing today. Second, I love the fact that several of you demonstrated so nicely that inequality is very much about labor markets, but also very much about the power of the elites and how we think about those two things. At the same time, it's important. Third, I think the short run, the huge shock that the pandemic represents, it was very clear around that discussion at the end that I am very sorry I had to cut. But it's just going to be seen in every dimension, right? Health, education, labor market, etc. And I think your discussion showed very clearly how setting priorities will be complicated, but it's very much something we need to continue discussing. And finally, this is about politics as much as policies, and you said it. I want to thank you all we had at the top 250 people listening to us. We had more than 30 questions, many of which we couldn't answer. And I think this was a testament to the quality of the four of you, about the importance of the agenda, and also a demonstration that, Luis Felipe, we must organize a conference in Oxford whenever it's possible, and hopefully soon. So many thanks to everyone, and please stay healthy as well.
Or you should organize a follow-up,
Yes.
in Zoom.
Absolutely.
Let us do that. Let us do that, Diego.
And we'll do that. We are absolutely do that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.